Imagine a quiet monk, someone really devoted to intellectual purity, who just dared to redefine how we even think about God's existence.
Hmm.
And he challenged kings and, well, fundamentally shaped Western thought for
That's
centuries.
quite a story.
Really is. Today, we're not just, dissecting old ideas. We're tracing the extraordinary journey of Anselm of Canterbury.
A fascinating mind.
Totally. A mind that bridged faith and reason with, honestly, a revolutionary kind of force.
Hmm.
Our mission in this deep dive is to pull out the most potent nuggets of knowledge and insight from your sources.
Yes, the article's research notes.
Exactly. To give you a shortcut, really, to being truly well-informed about this pivotal figure.
Because he really is pivotal.
Absolutely. Get ready to uncover some surprising facts, connect his, well, profound ideas to how we understand things today, and explore why this 11th century philosopher and theologian still echoes so powerfully.
Especially in conversations about belief, logic, reality itself.
Right. We'll cover his life, the wild era he navigated, his unique approach to faith and reason, and some of his most enduring, even controversial arguments. This is going to be quite an intellectual adventure.
It absolutely is an adventure, yeah. And one that really demands we understand the very soil, you could say, from which Anselm's revolutionary ideas grew.
Hmm.
You see, his intellectual contributions, they're so deeply embedded in the context of his time
Right.
that just looking at his arguments sort of in isolation, you'd miss so much of their brilliance, their daring, and, well, a profoundly revolutionary nature.
That makes sense.
We're talking about a period of intense reformation in Europe, a slow but undeniable shift that really set the stage for much of what we recognize today as Western civilization.
That's the perfect starting point, because here's where it gets really interesting. Before we even dive into Anselm's specific ideas, like you said, we need to step back.
Yeah, set the scene.
Imagine Europe in the 11th century. What kind of world truly shaped a mind like Anselm's? Why is understanding his era so incredibly crucial to genuinely understanding him and the impact of his work?
It's crucial because the 11th century, the period Anselm lived in, it's often called the early scholastic period.
Okay.
And that's not just some academic label, it signifies a really pivotal moment when intellectual inquiry was starting to formalize, to become a school of thought, quite literally.
Right, a system.
Politically, Europe was still very much defined by feudalism, that intricate, sometimes pretty brutal web of loyalty, land, and service that had really taken root across the continent after the Roman Empire collapsed.
So that hierarchy was key.
Absolutely. It wasn't just an economic system, it was the bedrock of how society was structured. It dictated power dynamics from the tiniest village right up to, well, the beginnings of kingdoms. You had this highly hierarchical system, land exchange for military service or labor. It created this really decentralized political landscape. You had powerful local lords and often a relatively weak, contested central authority in many places.
And that fragmentation must have directly impacted intellectual life.
It did directly. It meant that serious intellectual pursuits weren't happening in, like, grand, state-funded universities like we think of today.
No, not at all.
Instead, they were happening in very specific, often quite isolated centers of learning.
So definitely not a time of bustling cities with public libraries everywhere. You couldn't just Google things.
Not quite. Knowledge was, yeah, by necessity, incredibly concentrated. I mean, think about our world of instant information where you can access almost anything from a device in your pocket.
It's a completely different universe.
It's a profound difference, yeah. Centuries of fragmentation, instability after Rome's collapse had left Europe culturally fractured. Roads were bad, trade was disrupted, mass literacy was, well, incredibly rare. For most people, daily life was just about survival within their local feudal setup. So education became this really precious commodity,
Right.
concentrated almost exclusively within a few privileged institutions. But, and this is important, what we also see starting in the 10th and 11th centuries is a kind of cultural and intellectual revival.
Okay, so things were starting to change.
Slowly, yes. And critically, this revival was centered almost entirely around monasteries and cathedrals.
Ah, the religious centers.
Exactly. These weren't just places for worship, they were the main places knowledge was kept, safe havens for intellectual work. Monks were meticulously copying ancient manuscripts, often the only way text survived from antiquity.
Incredible dedication.
It was. And cathedrals, with their attached schools, they became the essential forerunners of our modern universities. Initially, they trained clergy, but by extension, they provided the limited formal education available at the time.
So there were these self-contained intellectual hubs.
Pretty much, often insulated from the wider political instability, offering this unique environment where study, contemplation, and rigorous thought could actually happen.
And within all that, the church was undeniably the dominant force, right? Not just spiritually, but politically, too.
Oh, without a doubt. The church, and especially the growing power of the papacy, held a central, almost unmatched role in European society.
Everywhere.
Yeah, it wielded both temporal, worldly, and spiritual power. Its influence stretched into nearly every part of life, from law and morality to governance, even crowning kings.
Wow.
And in this intellectual ecosystem, theology wasn't just a discipline. It was considered the king of academic disciplines.
The top dog.
Absolutely. It was the ultimate pursuit, the study of God, seen as the supreme source of all truth, all knowledge. Philosophy, then, served explicitly as its tool.
A tool. How so?
Well, it wasn't meant to diminish philosophy. Not at all. It meant that philosophical thinking was seen as totally essential for clarifying, articulating, and defending theological truths, for making sense of divine revelation using human reason. It was a rigorous means to a higher end.
So philosophy wasn't really about independent exploration just for its own sake. It was more like a handmaiden to theology.
That's a classic way to put it, yes. A handmaiden. And the sources mention something really important. Aristotle's philosophy hadn't yet widely spread in the West.
Right, that seems significant. What did that mean for how people thought back then? Who was influencing them?
It's a critical piece of the puzzle, yeah. Because Aristotle's logic and empiricism, they would later revolutionize medieval thought, mostly through Arabic translations that came much later.
Oh, okay.
But in Anselm's time, thinking was overwhelmingly influenced by Plato and the Neoplatonists.
Plato and Neoplatonism. What
Oh.
did that emphasize?
It meant a strong emphasis on what they called universals. So, to give you a quick idea of Neoplatonism's influence, imagine a perfect, unchanging blueprint for justice or beauty existing in some divine realm, totally independent of any flawed example here on Earth.
Okay, like perfect forms.
Exactly. Anselm, following that tradition, saw God as the ultimate perfect form from which all other beings imperfectly derived. This made him really comfortable with abstract, a priori reasoning thinking based on definitions and logic, rather than just observing the world.
I see.
Neoplatonism, with its hierarchy of being flowing down from a transcendent one, it provided a philosophical framework that really resonated with Christian theology. It emphasized a single transcendent God as the ultimate source of all existence and goodness.
In this context, this Neoplatonic influence, this is where we start to see the foundations of the scholastic method emerging. This idea of balancing church dogma with an inquiring spirit.
Precisely. The scholastic method came about directly from this need. How do you reconcile the church's official dogmas, accepted as revealed truth, with this inquiring spirit of philosophers who wanted to understand those truths rationally?
Right, the tension.
So it was a systematic approach to knowledge, trying to clarify, defend, and elaborate on Christian doctrine through rigorous logical analysis and structured debate or disputation.
Can you paint a picture of what that looked like in practice?
Sure. Imagine a student in a medieval school debating a question like, is free will compatible with God knowing everything beforehand?
Okay, classic one.
Yeah. The scholastic method would involve presenting arguments for the idea, then arguments against it, considering different interpretations from authorities, scripture, church fathers, maybe some classical philosophers, and then, through really careful logic, reaching a synthesized, coherent conclusion, the resolutio.
So it's like intellectual wrestling, not just memorizing.
Exactly. And Anselm was absolutely at the forefront of this. He wasn't interested in just accepting faith blindly. He wanted to interpret philosophy and theology in harmony, to make sense of faith within the limits of reason.
But his goal wasn't necessarily to prove faith to non-believers.
Not primarily, no. It was more about demonstrating its inherent rationality and coherence to believers themselves, offering a deeper understanding of what they already held to be true. And it was this vibrant, historical, and intellectual background that really shaped Anselm's own remarkable life.
Okay, so who was the man at the heart of all this ferment, this powerful religious and political world, this intellectual revival, this new way of thinking. How did it all come together in Anselm's personal story? Tell us about his journey. How did his experiences actually shape his ideas?
Well, Anselm's story is really compelling, a testament to the intellectual opportunities, limited as they were back then. He's born in Aosta, Italy, 1033, into a noble family.
Ah, so he had some privilege.
He did, yeah. That background gave him access to a certain level of education. But his true calling came pretty early. He entered a monastery young, specifically the Benedictine Abbey of Bec in Normandy, and right away he showed both deep piety and a remarkably sharp mind.
And entering a monastery back then, that was more than just a spiritual choice.
Oh, definitely. For many intellectually curious people, it was the main way to get a serious education. We don't have secular universities everywhere like today. Monasteries were the centers of learning. They preserved texts, trained scholars, and provided that disciplined environment for contemplation and study that was just rare elsewhere.
So it was almost like going to the top graduate school of the 11th century, but with a monastic vow, a kind of intellectual powerhouse.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. A monastic intellectual powerhouse. And inside the monastery, he was steeped in the classical and Christian texts that were the bedrock of medieval thought.
Your sources mention Augustine, Boethius, and Plato as big influences.
Huge influences. Augustine with his rich theology of grace, free will, God's nature. He laid so much groundwork for Anselm's theological questions, and his focus on that internal contemplative path to truth.
Okay. And Boethius.
The Boethius, a 6th century Roman philosopher, he was crucial for logic. His writings and his partial translations of Aristotle's logic were basically the main source for Aristotelian logic in the early Middle Ages. For many, Boethius was logic.
Wow.
And Plato, mostly through those Neoplatonic interpretations we talked about, shaped Anselm's understanding of universals, the hierarchy of being, and that pursuit of ultimate truth beyond just the sensory world.
And how did that very disciplined monastic life, that focused existence, how did that shape him? What kind of questions do you think he was wrestling with in those early years, maybe tucked away in a library?
That disciplined environment was absolutely crucial. It nurtured both his spiritual and intellectual sides together. I mean, imagine dedicating your youth, not to, worldly stuff or politics, but to deep contemplation, rigorous study, meticulously copying and analyzing ancient texts.
It's hard to imagine today.
It really is. This environment encouraged deep introspection and a systematic, logical way of thinking. The sources suggest he wasn't just memorizing, he was really grappling with foundational questions.
Like what?
The nature of God, existence, knowledge, and ethics. And for a monk, these weren't just abstract topics, they were deeply personal, existential questions.
Right.
How does God really exist? What does it mean for anything to exist? How do we actually know anything, especially divine truth? And what makes a life good, moral, in God's eyes? This intense, focused dedication, mostly free from the distractions of secular life, it allowed him to build the intellectual and spiritual foundations for his later, really groundbreaking work. It's a very different way of learning compared to our often fragmented modern paths.
It's a stark contrast, definitely. So from this focused monastic life, his abilities must have become obvious, and that led to some pretty big roles. Eventually Archbishop of Canterbury. That sounds like a massive jump, not just religiously, but politically too.
It was an enormous leap, yeah. It shows how highly regarded his intellect and spiritual authority were. His skills definitely got noticed. First, he became abbot of Bec, and then eventually Archbishop of Canterbury in England in 1093.
Wow.
And this wasn't just a spiritual leadership job. It was a position of immense religious and political significance. It put him right at the center of Anglo-Norman power.
And England at that time, like elsewhere, had that big power struggle between the church and the crown.
Oh, yeah, a serious power struggle. The core issue was the investiture controversy, basically. Who gets to appoint bishops and abbots? The king or the pope?
Ah, so it's about control.
Exactly. Control over vast church lands, huge amounts of money, and the loyalty of powerful clergy. Kings wanted to appoint their buddies. The papacy wanted independent appointments to keep its authority.
So not just theology, but real-world power struggles over land, loyalty, money. And Anselm, this deep thinker, was right in the thick of it. Did he try to avoid it?
Not at all. He found himself in these bitter conflicts, first with King William II, William Rufus, and later with King Henry I.
Really?
Yeah. His efforts were consistently aimed at limiting the king's influence over the church, fiercely protecting the church's independence, and asserting the pope's authority and appointments against the king's interference.
That sounds dangerous.
It was. For taking these principled stands, for his unwavering commitment to the church's autonomy, he was exiled, not once, but twice, for significant amounts of time, basically kicked out of his powerful job in England.
Exiled twice.
Yep, spent years on the continent, couldn't go back. But what's truly remarkable is that even these years of political struggle and forced exile didn't stop his intellectual production.
No way.
In fact, some of his most important works, like Cur Deus Homo, which we should definitely talk about later, were actually thought up and written during these exact periods of political banishment.
That's incredible. It's almost like the adversity fueled him instead of stopping him. It reminds me of artists who do their best work when they're forced into solitude or hardship. What does that tell us about his dedication? And I read somewhere that during one exile, he actually taught in southern Italy and still wrote major works, turning exile into a sort of intellectual retreat.
That's a perfect observation and a great point about his teaching in Italy. It really speaks volumes about his unwavering dedication, his fundamental belief in reason and understanding.
Yeah.
For many people, those kinds of intense political fights in exile, they'd be crippling, lead to despair, stop the intellectual work. But for Anselm, it seems like it was an opportunity for deeper thought, for writing without the immediate crushing demands of being archbishop. His intellectual life was so deeply tied to his spiritual life that even hardship became fertile ground for thinking, a kind of forced retreat for deeper contemplation. He died back in Canterbury in 1109, and his legacy was recognized almost immediately.
He became a saint.
Yes, declared a saint by the church. And today he's held in enduring respect as both a spiritual and intellectual figure in Catholic and Anglican churches. His story just exemplifies a life where intellectual pursuit and spiritual conviction were totally intertwined, even when facing huge political pressure.
Wow.
And with that understanding of his life and times, now we can really dive into the core of his philosophical and theological contributions, which are, the bedrock of his lasting influence.
Okay, let's get into the heart of what makes Anselm so pivotal, his unique, maybe even revolutionary approach to faith and reason, famously summed up in his motto, Credo ut intelligam. I believe that's just been such a profound idea, a real cornerstone.
It truly has, and it's the very core of his methodological contribution. Anselm adopted and really in many ways defined this scholastic method in his work.
Right.
And it's important to grasp what this means. It was a systematic approach, aiming to uncover true knowledge through logical discussion and dialogue, really pushing the boundaries of what could be rationally understood within a theological framework.
So like a structured way of thinking.
Exactly. Think of it as a rigorous process of intellectual inquiry. The method usually involved presenting doubts or questions about an idea, then offering counter-arguments or different interpretations.
Okay.
And finally, through meticulous logical analysis, determining the most consistent and true view. This wasn't about blind acceptance or just repeating what you were told.
No.
It was about interrogating that wisdom, pushing it to its logical conclusions, and showing its inherent rationality and coherence.
So it was revolutionary because it moved beyond just simple acceptance of dogma. It invited a deeper, more analytical way of engaging with faith, a kind of proactive searching.
Exactly. For Anselm, faith, sides, and reason ratio are not conflicting but complementary concepts. And this is a fundamental difference from how some might see it today, where faith is often seen as being against reason or requiring you to suspend it.
All right, and that's a common view now.
For Anselm, it was the opposite. One must first believe. Faith makes the work of reason possible. Now, this isn't to say reason proves faith, but that faith provides the necessary foundation, the very lens, you could say, and the direction for reason's activity when thinking about theology.
Okay, so you start with belief.
You start with the belief, that commitment, and then you use your intellect to understand what it is you believe and why it makes sense. So if there's one core nugget from Anselm's method, it's this. For him, faith isn't a blindfold. It's the very lens through which true intellectual understanding of divine truths becomes possible.
That's a powerful image.
It's not about proving God to non-believers necessarily, but about deepening the believer's own rational grasp of their faith.
And that's where Credo ut intelligam comes in, right? I believe in order to understand, it perfectly captures that idea. It kind of flips the usual order on its head.
It does.
It almost challenges our modern sort of empirical assumptions about how we get knowledge.
It absolutely does. Credo ut intelligam. I believe in order to understand, it's not just a catchphrase, it's the fundamental motto of medieval scholasticism. It means faith isn't the end point of inquiry, it's the starting point, the bedrock. It provides the light, so to speak, by which reason can navigate these profound truths about existence and God.
So it's about seeking understanding within belief.
Precisely. Seeking deeper understanding and intellectual clarity within the framework of one's beliefs, rather than trying to arrive at belief through pure, unassisted reason from some neutral starting point. This really does reverse common modern assumptions about belief and logic. I mean, how often do we think about our beliefs enabling our rational inquiry?
Not often enough, probably. It's a subtle and powerful shift.
It is.
And from this foundation, this credo intelligum, he launched into what's probably his most important and controversial contribution, the ontological argument for God's existence.
Ah, yes, the big one.
This one always seems to spark intense debate, doesn't it? Even among philosophers who really admire him otherwise.
It certainly does, and that's really a testament to how radical it was and still is.
Yeah.
The ontological argument is a metaphysical claim trying to prove God's existence through reasoning alone.
Just reason. No outside evidence.
None. It's an a priori argument. That means it relies entirely on logic and concepts, on the very definition of God, rather than on observing the world around us. It's purely a thought experiment.
Okay, walk us through the steps. How did he lay it out in his proslogion?
Right. So first, he defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Okay, the greatest possible being.
Exactly. That's the core premise. God is the greatest, most perfect being imaginable. You cannot conceive of anything superior.
Got it.
Second, he notes that this being, this concept of that than which nothing greater can be conceived, exists at least in the mind, in the world of concepts. Even someone denying God has to have some idea of what they're denying.
Makes sense. Otherwise, what are you denying?
Right. Third, and here's the crucial step, the logical leap. Anselm says that if this being, this greatest conceivable being, only exists in the mind as just an idea, then a greater being could be conceived. Why? Because a being that exists in reality, not just in the mind, would be greater than one that's only an idea. Real existence, for Anselm, is a kind of perfection.
Okay, existence is better than non-existence.
Fourth, this leads directly to a contradiction. It's illogical. If the greatest being conceivable only existed in the mind, then it wouldn't actually be the greatest conceivable being, because you could then conceive of an even greater one that actually exists in reality.
But the definition said nothing greater can be conceived.
Exactly. That's the bind. It contradicts the initial definition.
So,
Fifth, and finally, therefore, God must necessarily exist not only in the mind, but also in reality. His existence is a necessary part of his perfection. To deny God's existence would mean conceiving of something greater than that which nothing greater can be conceived, which, by Anselm's own definition, is a logical absurdity.
wow, okay, that's a mind-bending argument. It feels almost airtight, logically, yet I know it's always sparked huge debate. It debates existence solely at the conceptual level, which is why it was so radical. But even back then, wasn't there a monk who immediately challenged it? It seems too neat not to get pushback right away.
You're absolutely right to point that out. The debate kicked off almost instantly. This approach was a radical innovation because it bypassed empirical evidence entirely. And its very elegance, as you say, made it an immediate target.
So who challenged it?
Yes, a contemporary monk named Granilo of Marmoutier. He famously wrote a response called On Behalf of the Fool.
Catchy title.
Isn't it? Gonila tried to use Anselm's exact logical structure to prove the existence of a perfect island, an island than which none greater can be conceived.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right. He argued if such an island only existed in the mind, then a greater one could be conceived, one that also existed in reality. Therefore, by Anselm's logic, this perfect island must exist in reality.
But that sounds absurd.
Exactly Ganilo's point. He argued this showed a flaw in Anselm's reasoning. You can't just define something into existence, even if the definition seems logically sound internally. This immediate challenge from Garnilo really set the stage for centuries of philosophical wrestling with Anselm's argument. It highlights its enduring impact, even with all the intense debate.
That's a brilliant counterargument, and it really clarifies why the ontological argument is still debated so fiercely. It plays right on that line.
Yeah.
What does it mean for something to exist just in your mind versus in reality?
Precisely.
Building on this, Anselm also developed a deeper view of being, right?
Yeah.
He synthesized Platonic and Aristotelian ideas to talk about a hierarchy of being.
He did, yeah. And this hierarchy of beings is absolutely fundamental to his whole metaphysical picture of the world. For Anselm, God is the necessary being.
Necessary being, meaning
Meaning God's existence isn't contingent, it doesn't depend on anything else. He must exist by his very nature. He's self-sufficient, eternal, he cannot not exist. All other beings, by contrast, are not necessary. Their existence is contingent, meaning it depends on God. They're derivative, created. They could theoretically not exist if God hadn't willed them into being.
so God is the ultimate independent reality, the uncaused cause, and everything else sort of hangs off him.
That's a good way to put it, yes. God is the essence of being itself, the very ground of all reality. Supreme, unchanging, eternal, perfectly simple. He is being itself without limits or change. The ultimate source of all truth, goodness, beauty.
And everything else.
Everything else, all beings dependent on God, are subject to imperfections, changes, and finitude. They come into being, they pass away, they're limited in power and knowledge, they're inherently mutable, always changing. This framework fundamentally shapes how he sees the world. It implies that true reality, ultimate perfection, rests only with God. Everything else participates in being to a lesser degree, always pointing back to its source.
Thinking about these degrees of reality, some things dependent, one thing truly independent. It definitely influences how you might see the world around you. Gives everything a kind of derived meaning.
It does. It imbues every creature, every moment with that derived meaning.
It's a very systematic, logical way to build a worldview, even if it starts from that foundational belief. But Anselm didn't shy away from the really tough questions, did he? The ones that often trouble theological systems.
No, he didn't.
Let's explore his thoughts on the problem of evil and also redemption. These are arguably some of the hardest, most emotionally charged questions in philosophy and theology.
They really are. These are the profound challenges that any systematic theology has to face. And Anselm's explanation of the problem of evil, well, it became a significant reference point in medieval theology.
Right.
He grappled with that classic dilemma. If God is all good, all powerful, all knowing, why is there evil in the world? Why do innocent people suffer?
The million-dollar question. How did he reconcile that? Was it a simple answer, something to comfort someone suffering, or more?
Metaphysical. Definitely not simple, but very logically consistent with his other views. Anselm's view was that evil is not an independent entity. It's not a real thing.
Not a thing. What does that mean?
It's not a substance like matter or some positive force existing in opposition to God, like in some dualistic views. Instead, he argued that evil is fundamentally the absence, deficiency, or flaw of goodness.
An absence.
Yes. This is known as the privatio boni doctrine. Literally, the privation or absence of good. Think of it like darkness not being a thing itself, but just the absence of light.
Or cold being the absence of heat.
Exactly. Or a hole in your sweater isn't something added, it's the absence of fabric where it should be. Evil is a lack, a falling short of the goodness that ought to be present.
Okay, so it's not something God created, but more like a defect, a negative consequence.
Precisely. That shifts the responsibility. Consequently, God, being by nature absolutely good, cannot create evil because evil, by definition, is a defect in what is.
So where does it come from?
The existence of evil, then, is explained by human misuse of free will. God created beings, humans, angels, with free will, which is a profound gift, a great good, right? It allows for genuine love, moral choice.
Yeah.
But that freedom inherently carries the possibility of choosing against the good, of turning away from God, of lacking the goodness they ought to pursue. So evil is not part of creation in its pure form, but a result that emerges through free will. It's a privation, a lack, a falling short.
That definitely impacts how you think about moral responsibility. Puts the onus on human agency, not on God as the direct cause of suffering.
It does. It offers a profound theological way to explain moral failings without directly blaming a benevolent creator.
That's a powerful framework.
Yeah.
And closely tied to evil is the question of redemption, right? How could humanity be saved from sin? Anselm tackled that head-on in his most famous theological work, Cur Deus Homo.
Indeed. Cur Deus Homo translates to Why God Became Man. It's really Anselm's masterpiece of rational theology. In it, he doesn't just describe salvation. He meticulously examines the logical and moral foundations of salvation. His central argument, often called the satisfaction theory of atonement, is basically this. Humanity, through sin, had incurred an infinite debt.
A debt like what?
A debt against God's honor and justice. In medieval society, honor was huge. An offense against someone's superior required satisfaction, some kind of recompense.
Right.
Because God's honor is infinite, the offense against it committed by finite beings like us also carried an infinite weight.
Infinite debt.
Which meant no mere finite creature, no matter how good, could possibly repay this infinite debt or restore God's infinite honor.
So a human sacrifice, even a perfect one, wouldn't cut it. The debt was just too massive for any finite being. Sounds like an impossible problem.
Exactly. The debt was infinite, so only someone with infinite capacity could repay it. This meant the debt could only be repaid by someone who was both fully God and fully human.
God and human, why both?
Fully God, to have the infinite capacity to offer a satisfaction worthy of God's infinite honor, and fully human, to stand as humanity's representative, to be able to pay on behalf of humankind.
Ah, I see the logic.
Therefore, Anselm argued, God came into the world in human form through Jesus Christ. Jesus, being both divine and human, could offer a satisfaction that was infinite in value, because divine, and offered by humanity because human.
Thereby paying the debt.
Yes, justly repaying the debt, restoring God's honor and justice, and offering salvation.
That is a highly logical, very systematic explanation for a core Christian belief. And it connects it tightly with ideas of justice and honor that must have really resonated back then.
It did, very much so, and it became one of the cornerstones of the medieval Christian understanding of morality and salvation. It offered this sophisticated solution for how God's justice and his mercy could be reconciled. Well, instead of just saying God forgives out of pure mercy, which might seem unjust to some, Anselm provided a rational, almost legal framework for how that forgiveness could be justly achieved. It ensured God's perfect justice was upheld even while his mercy was extended. It's not just theology, it's a profound statement about justice, debt, sacrifice, all presented with this almost mathematical rigor. It really makes you think about those concepts differently when laid out so logically.
It certainly does. It's a very different way to approach those core beliefs. But beyond his specific arguments, Anselm's way of thinking, his method, that insistence on reason and logic within faith, that had an even broader impact, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
So what does this all mean for us today? How does Anselm's deep dive into these fundamental questions keep resonating? He really does seem like a pioneer.
He absolutely was a pioneer, yeah. Anselm is widely seen as the precursor of scholasticism in medieval thought. While the method would be developed further by later thinkers, Anselm really laid down many of his foundational principles and showed its immense power. His philosophical and theological views profoundly influenced later scholastic philosophers. He provided both a methodological template and specific arguments that just spurred debate and development for centuries.
And who were some of these later giants he influenced? And how did they build on or react to him? I imagine they weren't just passively accepting everything.
Oh, no, definitely not. The list is distinguished, really a who's who of medieval philosophy. You see his influence clearly in figures like Thomas Aquinas.
The big one?
Yeah, perhaps the most famous scholastic. He later synthesized Aristotle with Christian theology in this huge, comprehensive system. Now, Aquinas ultimately didn't accept Anselm's ontological argument.
Interesting.
But he built profoundly on the scholastic method. He engaged deeply with the questions Anselm raised about God, existence, revelation, but often came up with different proofs or conclusions.
Okay, who else?
Another incredibly important figure is Duns Scotus, a Franciscan who, while often agreeing with Anselm's foundations, also offered subtle counterpoints. He particularly emphasized God's will maybe more than his intellect in divine actions.
Right. And then there's William Ockham, famous for Occam's razor. He rejected many universalist ideas, favored empirical observation more, but he was still operating within that framework, those rigorous logical expectations set up by early scholastics like Anselm.
Wow.
I mean, imagine setting the intellectual stage for centuries of debate and an entire intellectual method that's the true scale of Anselm's influence. He wasn't just a thinker. He was an architect of an intellectual tradition.
That's an astonishing legacy, but maybe even more fascinating, his most famous argument, the ontological one, is still being debated today. It just refuses to go away, doesn't it?
It's incredible how enduring it is, yeah. The ontological argument remains a much debated topic in modern philosophy, a perennial philosophical puzzle.
Still?
Oh, yeah. It's been examined and criticized by many philosophers from Kant to Kierkegaard, and it still gets significant attention from contemporary philosophers of religion.
Like Kant. What did he say?
Well, Immanuel Kant in the 18th century famously critiqued it by arguing that existence isn't a predicate.
meaning that adding exists to a concept doesn't actually add to the concept's content. It just states that the concept has an instance in reality. So for Kant, you can define a perfect $100 bill, list all its perfect qualities, but that doesn't make it appear in your pocket. You can't just define something into existence.
Ah, that makes sense.
And Søren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher, he also critiqued these kinds of rational proofs. He emphasized the importance of a subjective leap of faith, personal commitment, over trying to get objective, rational certainty in religious matters.
So different lines of attack.
Exactly. But these deep criticisms don't really negate the argument's importance. They highlight its intellectual staying power. It keeps provoking profound thought, serves as a benchmark for discussions about the limits of reason and the nature of God.
So even if philosophers disagree with the conclusion, the argument itself is like a philosophical touchstone, a mental workout.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. And what about, I believe in order to understand? Is that still relevant even for people who might not share Anselm's specific faith?
Absolutely. Anselm's Credo and Intelligum approach is still a fundamental reference for understanding the complex, often tangled relationship between our foundational beliefs, whether they're religious or secular, and our rational inquiry.
How so?
It challenges us to consider how our starting assumptions, our initial commitments, actually shape our intellectual investigations and how we interpret the world. It's a powerful reminder that where we start often dictates the questions we ask, the evidence we look for, the paths our reasoning takes. So even if you don't agree with his specific conclusions, the way he approached these questions still shapes how we think about the limits of reason and the crucial, often overlooked role of belief in shaping our understanding. What an incredible journey we've been on today. Anselm really is one of those rare thinkers who profoundly influenced his own time and just made lasting contributions for centuries after. He was operating in a world totally different from ours. Powerful monasteries, warring kings, yet the problems he tackled, the nature of God, evil, faith, and reason, they're still very much with us.
Still the big questions.
Yeah. And he didn't shy away from them. He approached them with a rigor that was revolutionary for his time.
Indeed. His life and work, they really formed some of the cornerstones of medieval scholastic thought. He showed it was possible to seek rational arguments for God's existence, to analyze complex theological problems like evil within a coherent moral and metaphysical framework. He showed that faith wasn't intellectually lazy, but actually a vibrant starting point for profound rational exploration. He was truly a philosopher of the highest order, dedicated to understanding the deepest truths, even when it led him into conflict and exile.
He really challenged us to seek understanding through our beliefs, to wrestle with the biggest questions, not just with our hearts, but with our sharpest minds. As you go about your day, maybe consider, where do you see that interplay of faith and reason in your own life? In your own beliefs, whether they're about the universe or just, how you approach a new project at work.
That's a great takeaway.
Or maybe think about what unthinkable ideas might actually turn out to be logically necessary if you just apply a different kind of reasoning. Step back and examine the concepts themselves.
It encourages that deeper level of thinking.
Exactly. We hope this deep dive into Anselm of Canterbury has given you plenty to mull over and maybe inspired you to do your own deep dives into the foundational assumptions that shape your world.
It's been fascinating to discuss.
It really has. Thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch you next time.